Massive change in the Middle East. Bashar al-Assad's regime falling apart. He fleeing hurriedly to Russia. In addition to that, Benjamin Netanyahu taking the stand as a defendant in his corruption trial in the middle of a war. And our mentioned Chuzpah Awards this week, quite sporty and holy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. Unholy two Jews on the news. We have two big guests for you this week, a sage luminary of the world of American foreign policy and an award-winning filmmaker. So we're going to bring you all of those.
Relevant to the two big stories of the week.
Absolutely.
Right?
They're going to talk about both of the things you mentioned about, Syria and about Netanyahu on trial. Just a tiny bit about ourselves. We are now 1 week into our new community on Patreon. If you're new to that, it's a whole area where you can subscribe to podcasts that you like. And we gave a lot of the details last week, and you can see more of them in the show notes. We'll have a link there. But just to say about that, we are tremendously grateful for, lots of people who've already signed up. Basically, the deal is we're still here in the normal way every Friday or late Thursday night, depending where you are in the world with this podcast. But if you want even more...
update episodes if necessary, of course.
Yeah, update episodes when they come. We'll still be doing those. You'll get access to them, wherever and whatever. But if you want even more on top of that, then you can subscribe to Patreon. We've got two sort of different levels, two different ways of doing it. So remind us again, Yoni, what do you get if you subscribe to one of these different levels?
So essentially, there are going to be bonus episodes that are Q&As and Zoom calls with us, if you'd like. Generally, just more of us. I mean, there are some weeks I want less of us. But if anyone wants more, they know how to do that. Just look at that Patreon link on our show notes.
Yeah, and I've had a few people mention to me they're quite excited about the Zoom call. I think the plan is to do that once every 3 months or so. Mm-hmm. Where you'll actually be on a kind of live call with the both of us. And I'm not saying ask me anything, because that could be, come back to haunt me as a promise. But no, we will hope to answer questions of yours on the Q&A episode, those bonus episodes, and on Zoom we can listen and talk. And it's all about building this community that has, really strengthened, particularly in the last year for reasons which are obvious and we've talked about. But this is all part of that. So, like we said, there's a lot of news this week, the huge epic news out of Syria. There's the Netanyahu on trial and appearing on trial. But we're going to get into those with our guests. But, there's other stuff going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think before we mention the two main pillars of this week, I think it's also important to say that there is this feeling, maybe more than that there is finally, more than a year after the original hostage deal that lasted for 8 days, there might be some hope for another hostage deal. This comes after both, we talked about this last week, President-elect Trump threatening that this must happen before he enters an office or else. But also Israeli officials saying that there might now be finally a chance for another deal. So the feeling in the air is that there is so much pressure put on all sides in this, that it could be that something might happen. There were already reports coming out, particularly in some Arab outlets, saying that there are already lists of names coming through. I don't know if there were that kind of optimistic stage. There was also a conversation between the newly appointed Minister of Defense, Israel Katz, and his counterpart, Lloyd Austin, about this. Israel Katz saying the same thing, essentially, that there might be a chance for a renewed deal that might actually happen.
Yeah, I mean, we have, and listeners will have gone through it with us, been round this block before, of course. We should mention that caveat. There have been moments where we thought we were on the brink of a deal. I think it was in May that Joe Biden, said it was days away, it was imminent. I think he, said when it was going to happen, it didn't happen. So things can fall apart, but there is that hope. And it relates a bit to at least one of the two stories we're going to talk about. I think the sense that there is, yes, the change in Washington. I'm sure Donald Trump, newly anointed as Person of the Year by Time magazine, will say it was all about him and him coming. But it may be an indicator or a function of the weakness of some of the other parties to this. And I'm thinking particularly of Hamas, that is seeing that its patron and its allies, namely Iran and Hezbollah respectively, are in a extraordinarily weak position, and that could be part of this mix as well. And of course, the man who we thought was the obstacle, or at least one of the major obstacles holding things up, Yahya Sinwar, now dead. A lot of people thought that might be the thing to unblock things quicker than now. Let's wait and see. If and when this happens, we can then analyze why it happened. But I think it's a mark of where we are at in the sort of geopolitics of this, and in particular the weakening of those who had until now stood right behind Hamas.
Yeah, and another video coming out this week. We should tell our listeners, Einat Tsangauka, one of the mothers of the hostages, Matan, who has been this sort of fierce warrior for her son, someone who has talked numerous times against Benjamin Netanyahu, admitting that she voted for him in the past, but she thinks that he is the main obstacle for a deal, and a video of her son for the first time coming out. This, of course, is not a coincidence. Hamas sadly understands the psyche of the Israeli society, and anyone, you don't need to understand Hebrew. We aired this video this week of her watching her son for the first time, just to see what this mother has been going through for such a long time, for 14 months, and to see her son for the first time. So you understand the urgency among the hostages' families and the rest of Israelis. One more thing we should mention that happened this week, I think, is very relevant to what is going on in this country. The fact that the coalition officially voted against setting up a state commission of inquiry. It's not that anyone thought that Netanyahu and his government wanted this, but this is an official coalition saying we don't want this, including the minister Dudi Amsalem, saying we don't want a state commission of inquiry. We want the people to be the commission of inquiry. So we should maybe just remind him that the people say in every poll, about 80% of the people who are asked in Israel say that they want a state commission of inquiry to figure out what and how this failure happened.
Just on that,
Sure.
if populism is always so hollow, but could there be anything more hollow than saying we want the people to have an inquiry? The people need the facts, and you need those facts, extracted, excavated by a serious, forensically equipped commission of inquiry. And the reason for this, by the way, I think the coalition and Netanyahu always talk about it as if it's only for the purposes of political blame. No. The 9/11 Commission, for example, changed the infrastructure of security and transportation so that it could not happen again. That's the purpose of this. It's not just about finger pointing. It's vital to do it. And previous Israeli generations have understood that. Ilana Dayan, when she was on our podcast the other day doing this wonderful English language reading of a lecture she'd given, went through the fact that in the past it was a matter of weeks before state commissions of inquiry were set up, and the famous one being the Agranat Commission into the Yom Kippur War. It was the same autumn that inquiry was already sitting. It is just part of the kind of narrowness, the constant sort of political politicking of Netanyahu and his ministers, that they are only seeing what's in it for them rather than this is being an absolutely important prophylactic, precautionary measure for the country that they are blocking and standing in the way.
Right. It's not only about what happened. It's about how we make sure it won't happen again.
Exactly.
So now I think we should move on to really the big story of this week around the world, really. And it's amazing, and the unexpected twists and turns of our lives since October 7th. I think no one could have, and including, by the way, the Israeli intelligence, could have imagined that this is where we will be, that Bashar al-Assad, right, the family that held, the Assad family that held Syria with an iron fist for half a century, crumbles in 11 days. I mean, this is 13 years into the civil war in Syria. Bashar al-Assad is responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of his own people. And the rebel groups taking over. And of course, it's a interesting thing. Yahya Sinwar, when he attacked Israel in such a vicious way, he wanted to change the Middle East. Well, the Middle East is now changed, not in the way that he wanted at all. And the fact that Bashar al-Assad's benefactors were not able to help him, each for their own reason. I think we'll get into this later in our conversation, but Russia, Hezbollah through Iran through Hezbollah were not able to help him, and he really toppled in 11 days. It is remarkable. I think for the first thing we need to say is that the world is a better place when Bashar al-Assad is not the ruler of anything. But the questions remain. Who are the people who will be set in place instead, and what is their agenda?
Yeah, we'll get into all of that with our guest. I mean, just a couple of things. First of all, you realize that these tyrants, these dictators, they're hollow men. And when it comes to it, so the minute the sort of scaffolding that had held up Assad, namely Russia and Iran, once they're away or once they're distracted or weaker, it just tumbles like a house of cards. A friend of mine sent me a message as it was happening and said, how does a rabble conquer the entire country in Syria and vanquish the leadership in 1 week? But we've been fighting in the small Gaza Strip for over a year and still haven't defeated Hamas. The slightly glib reply I sent back was, that's the difference of popular support. You just realize that the people of Syria were immediately going to side with this small rebel force that were bent on toppling Assad. And that's why they were able to sweep through so quickly from Aleppo to Homs to Damascus, because the people wanted them to succeed. And that's obviously the huge difference. I mean, there are many, many differences. But that the people were with them. At the moment, I think it's right to take just a minute and savor this moment for the Syrian people. Those images of people streaming out of these hideous gulags, these jails, dungeons where they've been kept, including cells underground, where the people had to dig deep for days to try and find their loved ones. I'm sure people have seen the image of children who were in there. It seems as if they were born in captivity. The degradation, the starvation, the torture, the beatings. I mean, this is a sort of circle of hell. And obviously, anyone who's followed the Middle East in recent years is going to bet on this all turning sour in the end and the new authorities being just another flavour of terrible. But for now, we can just allow that this is a liberation for the people who are there, whether it then turns out to be something very different. But this is people who've lived under dictatorship a long time and suddenly have a taste or a glimpse of something better.
Yeah, and I think, again, we will talk about Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who is the head of the rebels, and what is his ideology, essentially breaking from ISIS in 2016, doing all of the things you want to do when you want to assure the West that you're okay, an interview to CNN and all that. But, I think that Israel is quite trepidatious. We should say it had this deterrence with Assad in a way that, remember, at least according to foreign reports, Israel could attack targets in Syria that were meant for Hezbollah for many years. And, there are those in Israel who say it's always better the devil you know. We don't know what kind of jihadists are going to sit on the border. That's never a good thing. And so there is some concern. There's also concern about the role that Turkey is playing in all this. And of course, we should note that Israel did immediately take over the buffer zone, which is separating Syrian forces from Israeli forces since the ceasefire of 1974. And essentially, we should say, decimating the Syrian military, what is left of it, for it not to threaten Israel, whatever, come what may. Maybe we should also mention a former Israeli prime minister who has been also indicted and jailed. We'll talk about a prime minister who's been indicted and stood trial in a minute. But I'm talking, of course, about Ehud Olmert, that against American wishes, President Bush at the time did attack the Syrian nuclear facility. And that would have been a very different Middle East that we would see today, right, if that hadn't happened. So maybe we should also mention that.
Yeah, he deserves, I think, retrospectively, some foresight, some credit for some foresight there. You're right, this would be a very different situation. Classic case of inside-outside Israel, this one. I think, you'll have seen that the United Nations and a lot of the world's media were sort of, have been, outraged is too strong because they've dialed it down, but they have been critical of Israel's immediate policy of airstrikes, 350 or so airstrikes against Syria's defense capacity, saying that this is, the country that's just trying to pick itself up and start anew, and Israel doing. I think there are almost nobody inside Israel or defenders of Israel or advocates of Israel around the world who would not think, yeah, that's criticism we're very, very ready to take. The idea that Israel should risk a potential al-Qaeda breakaway having chemical weapons and a full arsenal right next door, there are not many countries, I think, that would run that risk. It may turn out that Jelani is a candidate for the Nobel Prize and wants to be, running a Swedish think tank. It may turn out like that, but it may not. And I think it is what you would expect. Somebody like me, extremely critical of almost every other decision that Netanyahu has taken since October 7.
I have not noticed that at all.
Just the odd one. And plenty before then. On this one, I think it's very hard to muster much of a criticism. We'll talk about it with our guest, but for the instinct that says if you have a moment of uncertainty, a void like this, it is too great a risk to allow, for example, a chemical arsenal into the hands of a group who from all of its ideological leanings, you would think, whatever if they thought of Assad, this is going to be a country deeply hostile, a grouping rather, deeply hostile, you would imagine, to Israel.
Well, this is a perfect time, I think, to bring in our guest for this week.
Richard Haass has been a leading figure of US diplomacy and foreign policy for the best part of 5 decades, an advisor to Colin Powell as Secretary of State in George W. Bush's administration. He also served on the National Security Council under Bush's father and was for 20 years president of the Council on Foreign Relations, leaving that post just last year. Richard Haass, welcome to Unholy.
Despite the name, I'm happy to be here.
We are very glad you're with us. So first off, you're foreign policy sage, but were you taken by surprise as much as everyone else by the fall of Assad in Damascus?
The short, honest answer is I was surprised. I just come a few weeks ago from the Middle East, and the subject of Mr. Assad had come up. And the thrust of the conversations, and this part I was on the listening end, was why don't you Americans reconcile yourselves to the fact that he's here to stay? It doesn't serve your interest to ignore him. And why don't you see if you could find your way back to a relationship with him? Maybe in the process you could reduce Iranian influence in Syria. And that was maybe, 3 weeks or a month ago. So a lot happened in a short amount of time.
Is it just because, or not just, but is the reason for this is there's two benefactors, Russia, Iran, just decided or couldn't, were too weak or too preoccupied to help him, and that's what happened?
Yeah, I don't think there was any decision on the part of his benefactors, if you will, to jettison him. Mm-hmm. What happened was, as you suggest, the Iranians, shall we say, were distracted and weakened. Mm-hmm. Russia has its hands full and then some in Ukraine. Simply doesn't have the military hardware to spare. Probably most important was Hezbollah, which turned out to be more central to the staying power of the Assad regime than, I won't speak for others, than I appreciated. And clearly the Turks and others sent some opportunity. So I think that explains the timing. To me, the interesting intellectual issue is why, though we were so wrong, I'd say we, most observers, in understanding what I describe as the brittleness of the regime. Why did we miss that? And I think that we confused steps that Mr. Assad had taken to what you might call coup-proof his regime, have an inner circle of security types he could depend on. But we underestimated the inherent, unavoidable, you might call it structural vulnerability of these highly personalistic regimes to challenge. And afterwards, I thought about why was I wrong? I almost dealt with it. I've been involved in government with intelligence analysis or as a policymaker where I got things wrong. So postmortems are useful. And in this case, I don't think we did enough analysis as to the nature of the regime. There weren't institutions. For example, the Chinese government, that's a system with 100 million members almost of the Communist Party, and so forth. But in places like the Shah's Iran, or Gaddafi's Libya, or now here, highly individualistic type arrangements with not a lot of institutionalization. And I think we simply missed that and didn't think it through.
If that's then the sort of spectrum of highly individualistic versus ones that have big institutional deep roots, I'm interested to know where you would put Iran now on the sort of brittleness spectrum, because a lot of people are wondering, is there going to be a sort of contagion after what we've seen in Syria? What's your assessment of the brittleness or not, maybe not, of the Iranian regime?
Yeah, I'm sorry to say I don't see it all that brittle. I mean, it's now, you had the revolution, 45 or so years ago. It still enjoys considerable public support. Maybe I would estimate, it might not be majority support, but significant parts of the society support it. And then you have indeed, what makes the Iranian government so hard is you have institutions on top of institutions. It's almost hard to speak about an Iranian government in the singular, but you have multiple centers of authority and decision-making, this fusion of the clerical and the political and the judicial. So my own view is, I'd almost say the Iranian regime is not as brittle as I would like it to be. I'm sorry to report. Good news is I'm wrong all the time, and I might be wrong there. But my own view is, like, if the Ayatollah were to die tomorrow, I don't see a fundamental change. We just recently saw the assassination of the president, and there wasn't any sense that the regime was somehow teetering on the brink. So I don't think the Iranian regime is that personalistic. You have now had multiple successions. No, the regime that I think is potentially personalistic and vulnerable is Russia. The hallmark of Putin's leadership is to deinstitutionalize Russia. It's kind of now it's cronyism and his friends, the oligarchs. And what makes it worrisome to me is there's very few restraints on Russia. So if Mr. Putin were tomorrow to decide to use a nuclear weapon of some sort in Ukraine, I'm not sure there's a lot of people who could stop him. He actually has more freedom of maneuver, I would argue, than Khrushchev had during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That same deinstitutionalization, I would think, leaves him vulnerable. And we saw it, not with Prigozhin. Had Prigozhin essentially marched towards Moscow, I don't know what the situation now would be in Russia. But coming back to your question, apologies for the detour, I don't see the Iranians as similarly vulnerable.
Sadly, we should say, I think, as you say as well. When you look at our region, and I'm tying us back to Syria, although this talk is going to other dimensions, which I think are really interesting. But when you look at the Abu Muhammad al-Julani and the fact that he's trying to kind of sell himself as something that is palatable to the West, right? He detached himself from ISIS in 2016. First of all, do you buy it? And what is the future of Syria? Are we going to see like Damascus as a city-state and the rest of it fractured? Like, where is this heading?
Well, two questions. On the first, if I could paraphrase rather than directly quote Ronald Reagan, I would say, don't trust, but verify. So I don't know to what extent they've evolved, distanced themselves from the likes of ISIS, distanced themselves from terrorism. I wouldn't take it at face value. I wouldn't dismiss it. I would simply give them tests and say, we're prepared to support you in certain ways. For example, diplomatic recognition, potentially certain types of economic help. They're going to have big needs, for example, in resettlement of refugees returning from Turkey and so forth. Well, here's the criteria you have to meet. And, for example, an obvious one would be not turning Syria into a safe haven for terrorism. We might have some criteria on human rights and the treatment of women so they don't become Taliban 2.0. So I can imagine doing that. And we'll find out. We'll find out to what extent they have changed their stripes. I don't assume, though, they're going to be in control anytime soon of Syria, of all of Syria. And I think that it's quite possible we will face a Syria that's somewhat balkanized, and that we could have a Syria where he and HTS control some significant portions of the country, many of the cities, but Turkish-backed forces of one variety or another could control others. The Kurds will have their area. Israel obviously has a buffer zone. I worry we could see the reemergence of ISIS or some other groups in some capacity. So I would think a future, the most idealistic future is a Syria that's under a single authority. It's a normal country, and it's a relatively benign one. Okay, you'd have to be, shall we say, a serious optimist to predict that. Down the scale, you could have Syria under one authority, but it's some, shall we say, less than benign, a Taliban-like Syria. I can imagine a Syria at war with itself. I can certainly imagine a Syria that's decentralized, that you have different entities in control of various parts of the country, and maybe a limited degree of fighting along the where they come into, this is not how we say, sharp borders, where they come into contact with one another. Plus outsiders, I already mentioned Israel, obviously there's the Turks, obviously Iran is not going to give up. And one thing in particular I worry about is the Turks might promote mischief, particularly against the Kurds. I think Mr. Erdogan is incapable of seeing Kurds as a legitimate national entity, sees them both as a threat to the Turkish state as well as a source of terrorism. I don't think he does a lot of discrimination in how he sees Kurds. So my guess is he will use this moment to go after the Kurdish military forces. So I don't think, in a sense, we've arrived at a new, steady state in Syria as yet.
Given all that, and your mention of the possibility of a kind of ISIS return or, resurgence and so on, what's your view on the legitimacy of the action Israel has taken, these 300 or more airstrikes designed and pulled off with extraordinary effectiveness to destroy Syria's military capability? You've had the United Nations and others sort of criticizing, saying it's got to stop. Yeah. What's your view?
Well, two reactions to what Israel's doing. What Israel has done under international law, I would argue, are preventive military strikes, not preemptive, because there was no evidence of imminent use, but preventive. Now, under international law, preventive military action doesn't get a lot of backing. That said, I think what Israel did was smart, to dechemicalize, if you will, and take away some other capabilities, rather than wait for the new leadership to emerge only to find out they are rather malign. I understand what Israel did, particularly with chemicals. I think they did us all a favor on that. I would say, there ought to be limits to what it does in terms of demilitarizing Syria. And then secondly, in terms of territory...
Just on that, are there risks in demilitarizing Syria for Israel?
Again, the risks are, if you so weaken certain authorities, do you create a possibility that, say, ISIS or some other groups, the military balance swings in their favor? So one just needs to think it through. Again, the enemy of your enemy can still be your enemy. And just because certain people are bad guys doesn't mean there aren't other bad guys or even worse guys. The other thing I think Israel should announce, which would be smart, is yes, it's moved in and it's occupying some territory. With all humility, what I would advise the Israeli government to do, I think it would be productive, would say that this is not permanent. Israel's aims are not territorial, and that if they were to be confident or assured by new authorities in Syria that these new authorities were willing and able to act responsibly and not pose a threat to, say, Israel, that Israel would be more than glad to relinquish the territory, some or all of the territory. That this is, if you will, a hedge against uncertainty rather than anything that seeks territory for its own sake. And I think that would be a smart thing to say if in fact, the government hasn't said something like that.
Yeah, and then Netanyahu put out a response along those lines, we should say. I will take this back to Iran. You were talking about Iran. You said it's not as brittle as what we saw from Assad. What we saw this year, obviously, unprecedented on so many levels, Iran attacking Israel directly, Israel attacking Iran directly, all of it out in the open. What, at the end of the day, should be done about Iran? I mean, I'm, out of the three of us, the only person living quite close to its target. So what should be done about it?
So maybe this will surprise you, but I actually see a real opportunity with Iran, not for regime change. I don't think you can base a foreign policy on that, no matter how desirable it might be. It's just too many factors, too hard to predict, much less engineer. But I would say, look, we've got three real concerns with Iran. One is their nuclear program. Second is their support for proxies. Third is how they treat their own people. Those are three pretty big baskets of concern. And what I would basically be open to is going to the Iranians and say, one way or another, we seek satisfaction on at least the first two, the nuclear and the proxy support. We'd like to see progress on the other. So you have a choice as to how we're going to get there. But what I would say, we're open to a grand bargain with you. But what we would need is a mutually acceptable low ceiling on your nuclear program with all sorts of arrangements for verification and monitoring. Secondly, an end to support for Hamas, military support for Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. And if you do that, we would be willing to relax most or all of the sanctions, say most of the sanctions. We would be willing to relax even more sanctions if you treated your own people with a degree of tolerance. So I would give them that offer. And if they refuse to accept it, we would also say at the same time, you should know, though, that we are prepared to use military force to achieve some of these same goals on the nuclear program and on the Houthis. So basically tell the Iranians, we're prepared to have a normal relationship with you. We're not seeking regime change. But here's the behavioral, policy changes we require from you. And it's really going to be up to you as to how these come about. But that's what I would put towards the Iranian government. And I actually think it's not inconceivable we can make some real progress. And I'm not normally associated with the word optimism, but I actually think there's a decent chance we could make some progress. But at least let's explore it. If it turns out the Iranians are uninterested, which is quite possible, and indeed you could have a real split in Iran, the new president might want it, the IRGC might oppose it, then okay, if you have to ever escalate or use military force, I always think it's important to have demonstrated that you tried other approaches. I think in terms of international public opinion, your own domestic opinion. So I would take a run at it diplomatically, and I would hope that the new American administration in coordination with Israel would do that.
So two questions that come from that. One, do you think the offer of relief from sanctions is incentive enough for them to move on not just one of those three things, but all, two at least, or even three of those three things? And then the other question is to look at this completely from the other way, which is the view that you don't kick a man when he's down. Actually, that's completely the right time to kick them. You kick somebody when they're weak, and the temptation to get Iran's nuclear capability now is the moment. And I just wonder if an incoming Trump administration would think, that it's the one moment where they're at their weakest, they're on the ropes. This is the time to take that out. Do you think there will be some who will be drawn to the very opposite of the kind of diplomatic carrot and stick approach and think, just let's reach for the big stick?
Well, again, that would be a debate over means, not ends. What we want is an Iran, that's no longer providing help to proxies. I'm not sure we can accomplish all that militarily and end to help for proxies. I'm not sure that's easily doable by military means. We can complicate it, as Israel has with, by weakening Hezbollah, by weakening Hamas. Obviously, the conduit through Syria has been to some extent removed. But, for example, support for Houthis, again, we can hurt them militarily. I'm not sure we can stop it. Second of all, the attack on the nuclear program, we could probably set back the program for years. Could we destroy it all? No. Can you destroy the knowledge? No. Can you prevent them rebuilding it in underground locations that maybe you couldn't reach next time? I'm not sure. So again, I would say Iran is down right now, so let's pursue ambitious ends.
Mm-hmm.
I would prefer to accomplish it diplomatically, in part because I think potentially we get better results. But again, if the diplomacy is rebuffed and Iran continues to help its proxies, if it continues to forge ahead with its nuclear program in terms of amount and levels of enrichment, we get intel that it's doing work on weaponization to reduce the amount of time it would need to have a viable nuclear device, then sure, I think then we have no alternative but to carry out, again, what I would call here a preventive military action about it. But I would just rather accomplish all that. I think we could probably accomplish more at less cost by diplomacy. Also, we'd avoid the possibility or probability of retaliation. Iran still has thousands of ballistic missiles, as Israel knows. It could attack all sorts of, say, Saudi and other energy installations, as they've done before. They could support various terrorism actions in Europe or the United States or elsewhere. So I don't think we should go lightly into turning this into a military confrontation. Yes, Iran is down, but the choice of instruments in foreign policy, I would say it ought not to be a military first choice.
You know, the thought that was prompted by seeing what happened and how quickly it happened in Syria, and the weakening of Hezbollah has made people wonder if we are, I know that this can go two ways, but if we are seeing the Middle East being reshaped before our eyes, if we are, what shape do you think it's taking?
That's a good question. Well, yes. I mean, if we had this broadcast, this conversation as recently as 15, 16 months ago, we would have talked about the Shia Crescent, the Iranian threat, both directly and indirectly to Israel. We would not have focused on Hamas, but we would have focused on Hezbollah. We would have assumed Assad was here to stay, Lebanon was a mess forever, and on and on and on. So suddenly we've got important parts of the Middle East looking different. Other parts of the Middle East, as an aside, are not looking different. Libya's not looking different. Egypt's not looking different. We could go down the list. And some places, I would say, are looking different in a slightly worse way, like the West Bank. That's a different conversation, perhaps for another podcast. But yes, I mean, one of the principal medium powers and one of the principal local powers, Iran, that has been much weakened. It's been shown to be vulnerable. Its proxies two of them have been devastated, decimated. Doesn't get close to it. Assad is gone. So all things being equal, there's been some positive developments. When I think about Yahya Sinwar and what he thought would be his legacy, I don't think he imagined a lot of this. Yeah. This was not the post-October 7th world he envisioned. The only tragedy is October 7th. Well, the principal tragedy is October 7th. But I would just say, though, a version of what we said about Syria, which is there have been some positive developments in the sense that certain changes. We should not assume, though, that they get locked in. That there's nothing inevitable about good things happening because some good things happened. Mm-hmm. Turning points only happen in history when the principal actors take advantage of them. So we'll see. Israel, for example, has been reluctant, I would say, to take advantage of its military gains in Gaza. We'll see. We'll see what happens there. Situation, I would say, has gotten worse in the West Bank. Real questions about whether this or some future Israeli government will reach an acceptable accommodation with Palestinian nationalism. Can you put the Humpty Dumpty that is Lebanon back together again? Will Syria turn out to be an Afghanistan, something worse, or something better? What will become of Iran? We could go down the list. So I would simply say There's a lot of things to work with. If you're a diplomat, this is a potentially creative moment, the kind of moment you would dream about. It's interesting. The Trump administration is going to come in, and the table's set for some interesting initiatives here. I've written elsewhere that the table's set for some initiatives with Ukraine. It's an interesting moment for them. But the real question is whether they and others take advantage of it. There's nothing inevitable about translating opportunity into accomplishment. But the possibilities are there. I think we have to acknowledge that.
Well, at least we can agree that the Middle East was always a mess, and it's originally the fault of one Englishman and one Frenchman that just drew the map wrong. Can we all agree on that and then move forward? Okay. Just as long as we know where to place the blame. Okay? We're good.
Yeah, that Sykes-Picot combination. Actually, we're seeing some of the fruits of their work in Syria, because it's a reminder, going back to the question about Syria, of just how Syria is this amalgam. It's anything but a homogenous nation state. It is a bit of an artificial creation. And heterogeneous countries, if they work, can be very successful, but they're hard sometimes to work. And we've seen throughout the Middle East that heterogeneous societies can become real fault lines if you're not careful. We saw that in Iraq and so forth. And like Iraq, you've had minority domination for a while. Whether it was the Sunnis or now it's the Alawites in Syria. So we'll see. But yes, Sykes-Picot. Their impact is now in its second century.
Let me just do one last. Sorry,
Yeah, sure.
It's just a coda to what you've just said, because it just came to my mind. Just from the narrow point of view of Israel, if Syria fragments and balkanizes and they're all turning inward and sort of fighting with each other, there will be some people, I think, who will think, well, that's better for Israel because they're not on our case. But what's better or worse from the Israeli point of view? A stable, perhaps unpleasant regime, or the kind of balkanization, fragmenting you've just described?
All things being equal, I would say a stable but not hostile regime. And you had that at times under particularly Assad, the father, or Israel and Syria in post-67 or post-73 rather, post-73 Israeli-Syrian relations were not all that bad. You had real stability. You had, and the negotiations never came to fruition. It was frustrating, but it was, you had all sorts of rules of the road. And it gave Israel the luxury of focusing on other things. So I would think that is preferable to a situation of where you have to worry about militias and terrorist groups and people coming across borders, and just you have to keep your eye on it, and you can't assume anything. So it's almost better the devil you know than the devil you don't type of a situation. Neither one is an ideal outcome. And obviously, Israel would like to have a Syria on its border, more like Jordan or Egypt or something like that. But I'm afraid that's not in the cards anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, you said it's a time for creative diplomats and probably for journalists who like news as well. Richard Haass, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You made us smarter. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks for what you do. This is you don't get a lot of good conversations like this anymore. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I mean, there were so many interesting things in that conversation. I'm taking that line that the enemy of my enemy is sometimes my enemy, which makes a lot of sense to how Israel is supposed to look at what is happening now in Syria. What he said about Russia and about Putin was incredibly interesting, right? That it could go both ways. Either he feels so emboldened that he could use, nuclear weapons in Ukraine, or the fact that his, regime is also very brittle. I mean, all of that is completely fascinating, a lot of what he said in that conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the extent to which regimes are hugely personalised can be their fatal flaw, and that's the sort of part of the brittleness kind of index I thought really fascinating. And he's cool. I perhaps was somehow expecting him to be more hawkish on the opportunity that I think some are spotting in this moment to take out Iran's nuclear capability, kind of, if not now, when? And he says, no, actually, the route is diplomatic. Perhaps in some ways we shouldn't be surprised. Richard Haass was an advisor to Colin Powell. He said since that within the debate in the Bush administration, he was on the skeptical side about the Iraq war. He said he was sort of only 60%, or he was 60% against it. So he's somebody who's going to favour that diplomatic track. But I thought very sober and realistic and honest about the things he, a foreign policy professional, did not see coming. Even just, in the last few weeks.
And we can remind our listeners in that regard that it was the Bush administration, Bush 43, that thought the right thing to do after Israel disengaged from Gaza, left Gaza, was to hold elections. And Israel and Ariel Sharon actually said, don't do it. But they went ahead and did that, and Hamas was elected. And of course, the rest is history. There's one thing, you said before we talked with Richard Haass, was why was Bashar Assad toppled so easily and Hamas is still such an uphill battle? The answer, of course, is Iran. Iran continued to support Hamas in so many ways through Hezbollah, through the Houthis in Yemen, in every way that they could. And they gave up on supporting Bashar Assad. You listen to what the leaders of Iran are saying now. We tried to help Assad, but we couldn't get into the closed area because Israel was blocking us. I mean, that's a little bit, like Phoebe Buffay and Friends saying, oh, I wish I could help you with a couch, but I don't want to. So that is, that is what Iran did at the end. And I think that is a major difference between what we saw in Gaza and what we saw in Syria.
Yeah, and just to underline one thing he said about why he thought that Israel had done potentially the world a favour in terms of taking out Syrian military capability, he focused strongly on chemical weapons. And if it wasn't clear in what I was saying at the top of the podcast, that was really my point too, that the rights and wrongs, the one thing that's very clear is you do not want chemical weapons being loose and getting into the hands of who knows who, and that was sort of my instinct too. That if there's support for this, it's for that very particular reason.
The investigations against Netanyahu began in 2015, which is a really long time ago, and many people thought that there would be no moment where he would actually take the stand. But this happened this week, and for the first time, he took the stand and gave testimony in his corruption trial, 3 corruption cases against Netanyahu, in fact. And before we go into our next interview, I think there are 2 things to mention. One is that Netanyahu, for a few years, has been saying, and he said in front of the High Court of Justice when they were contemplating whether or not he can indeed run a government while being indicted for corruption, he said he will have no problem to run the country and also, fight for his innocence. Again, he said that, reiterated that after October 7th. So lo and behold, there was still an attempt by Netanyahu, his lawyers, and his supporters to postpone his trial, his day in court as much as they could. But at the end, the judges gave a very short delay, and he began giving his testimony. Historic moment for Israel, not in a good way, but still, it is a moment. Netanyahu's line of defense generally has been from the beginning, and he went on. Of course, I think the cross-examination will be the moment where it begins to be interesting. But his line of defense thus far is, I don't remember and I don't know. And I was not aware, really, would probably be the most accurate way of saying it. There's one thing that I find really interesting, that 2 out of the 3 cases against Netanyahu, and particularly case 2000, case 4000, have to do with Netanyahu's attempt to influence the media. One has to do with the media outlet Yediot Ahronot, the main newspaper in Israel, and the other has to do with the internet site Walla. I'm not going to go into the intricacies of the allegations and the indictment, but ever since Netanyahu, I would make the point, became much smarter, and what he actually did was just set up media outlets instead of trying to influence the original ones. Just set up media outlets that speak for him and are his megaphone. So I just make those 2 notes. before we go into our next interview.
I mean, you're right not to get stuck into the weeds of these charges. Just to bring people up to speed, the guts of these cases, there's obviously a lot of detail, but the essentials are that Bibi Netanyahu was in receipt of things that benefited him, whether that was media coverage in a couple of the cases or literally material benefits, cigars and champagne and so on, in return for things he could do to benefit those people giving him these things, whether that was help with, tax or visas or, whatever. So that's the sort of thrust of these cases. He has turned it, as far as I can see, into his usual, and I've used the word populism already today, but into his usual sort of populist theme, which is forget the details of this. It's me. I'm the victim. I'm representing you, the people, and the elite, the establishment are out to get me, whether that's the media or the judiciary. It seems to me, the old tune he is playing once again. Now, with impeccable timing, a film that has been steadily being released across the world, it's actually just this week, released here where I am in the UK, comes out, which sheds new and pretty stunning light on this whole saga.
Alexis Bloom is a documentary filmmaker who has been nominated for 3 Emmy Awards. Her previous subjects included the late Roger Ailes of Fox News and the mother-daughter duo of Debbie Reynolds and Carrie. But now she has turned her gaze on Israel with one of the most talked about films of recent times. It's called The Bibi Files. It has only now been released in the UK. It's already out in the US. We should say it can't be shown in Israel for reasons we will shortly get into. Alexis, thank you so much for talking to us this week.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, look, this couldn't be more timely, your film and Netanyahu's testimony. And we'll talk about the connection between the two. We should say that in Israel, this can't be shown. Would you want to explain why? Should I explain why the Israel is actually paradoxically can't see it?
I'll update you that it's been pirated widely. It's one of the most pirated films they've seen, I think. It's been passed from phone to phone, like wildfire. So, officially, I'm shocked and horrified and it's terrible. And unofficially, I'm pretty delighted.
Noted.
It's for reasons, it's a privacy law that you cannot show police interrogations without the permission of those in them. So it predates this film.
Yeah, you need the permission of the court, which wasn't given in this case. As you say, I would assume there are many Israelis who have seen it. And, for Israeli, I'm talking here from the Israeli perspective, some of the things from the interrogations, some quotes have come out over the years, obviously, but to see some of the people in those rooms being investigated, the Sarah Netanyahu, Yonit and Jonathan in particular, those, I think, are things that are very shocking for many Israelis. What is the thing that shocked you the most when you saw this footage?
Well, I didn't know much about Yair and Sarah, so that certainly, their behavior and their disrespect certainly shocked me too. The level of kind of almost like denigration that they showed towards the police investigators. And actually, there was so much more of it. We were quite restrained in the film. There was a lot of yelling at policemen. There was a lot of insulting of them. But I felt that as entertaining as that might be, and as tempting as it was to use it to make them look bad, it isn't the point of the film. Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister, and they're not. And the ultimate responsibility lies with him. So if he has slightly unhinged family members, that might be, unfortunate, but, he has to put on his big boy pants and rule the country and sort of keep them out of it.
So we should just stress the guts, the heart of the film of this amazing footage of police interviews with Netanyahu himself and then everyone else involved, including crucial witnesses, filmed in a sort of CCTV style way, which is just adds to the intensity of it. Obviously, you're not going to reveal your sources, but we wouldn't expect that. But can you just give us any flavour at all of how you came to be in possession of these amazing recordings?
Yeah, sure. In about, I think it was spring 2023, somebody reached out to Alex Gibney, the producer on the film, and said, I have some interesting material on Signal. And to his credit, he sort of tugged on the thread. And then ensued this sort of dance of trying to establish, what the material was and everything like that. So you're right, I can't say anything more than that, but that's how it happened. And I think they approached an American filmmaker precisely because the material cannot be shown in Israel. So they had to look for somebody outside who would have the sort of the gumption, the chutzpah to do it.
When you think of, first of all, I'm curious if you followed Netanyahu's own testimony in court this week. Mm-hmm. What do you think of just the internal argument here? He for a while trying to postpone, saying there's a war going on. There is indeed a war going on. He is indeed the prime minister. It is 3 days a week in which he was supposed to give his testimony. Just curious what where you fall on what you saw this week of his testimony.
Well, I think that the trial would go a lot quicker if he stopped grandstanding. Mm-hmm. He says that he doesn't have the time, then he should just get to the point. Mm-hmm. Because as far as I can see, he's used it as a platform to sort of emphasize his importance on the world stage. So he's talking about everything, from Syria to Iran to, anecdotes about Barack Obama and things that seem not that relevant to the trial.
Mm-hmm. And I want to get to that bad things happen for a minute. Yes, he is indicted for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. So these are very, very severe corruption indictments in any case. You do bataille in the film between this corruption and the cases themselves, case 1000 and 2000, 4000, which you mentioned, the Bezikwala and the Alovich case, and what happened on October 7th. Can you walk us through that attempt to sort of tie the both of them together?
Well, they're tied together because, they're tied, it happens even before that, right? Mm-hmm. When the corruption cases are brought to indictment, the center and the left in Israel both say, we won't rule with you. We won't provide you with the sort of coalition partnership that you need. And I think that's what sets off these dominoes. I think about it like a sort of deadly dominoes, right? They abandon him. They say, you should resign, like everybody else before you. You should resign. And he says, no. It's the deep state. They're out to get me. And it's at that point that the alliance with the extreme right is made. And that leads, first of all, to the proposed judicial overhaul. And then, secondly, into the way that they wage the war post-October 7th. So when you say they're connected, they are connected. But the string, I think, is tied before October 7th.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I buy that logic completely, that the war keeps going in order to keep the coalition together, and the coalition stays together to keep him out of jail. So that's the sort of connecting thread. There's one bit which is, will also be shocking to people if they don't know it already, which is, and the film criticises his decision to keep the cash flowing to Hamas, suitcases in vehicles that's come from Qatar and goes into Hamas. Plenty will obviously be horrified by that, but if they didn't know it already, but is there a connection there with the corruption cases that you've laid out in the earlier part of the film?
No, that's not connected to the corruption cases. I would say that's just connected to some very bad decision-making on Netanyahu's part and serves to erode this idea of him as Mr. Security. It's actually the one piece of the film that isn't connected, but is so important we felt like we had to include it, and it sits adjacent to the trials because it's happening at the same time as he's being investigated. It's not that he allowed the cash to go through, because Hamas has always received money from Israel. So has the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority. They can't generate, or, they don't have an airport, they don't have a port, they can't get money without the approval of Israel. But that he escalated it. It went from a certain amount of money to, 10 times that amount. So, yeah, he didn't start it, but under his regime, under his rule, it was given this sort of like super injection.
Obviously, anyone who does what you do in life and documentaries has to care very deeply about the subject matter, but it really seems like it's something you're very, very passionate about, this topic.
Yeah, I am. I think that you can't do this half-heartedly. The stakes are incredibly high, and we fact check assiduously, and you might not like what's in the film, but we have taken it very seriously and we've really fact checked it.
Did any of the Netanyahu people, by the way, make any contact with you around this
No, we asked Benjamin for an interview, and I sent through 3 requests. I got an acknowledgement that they were received, but in light of the fact that his last big American interview was with a guy called Dr. Phil, who's like a daytime talk show host. It seemed unlikely that he would give us an interview. And frankly,
he doesn't have a very good record in interviews in Hebrew either, so,
Yeah, that's true.
You two can bond about the being in the refusal club from. I just want to ask about the supporting cast, if you like. Because some of the jaw-dropping moments are Yair Netanyahu and his extraordinary sort of contempt and rudeness to discourtesy to the police who are interviewing him. And then Sarah Netanyahu really on film is caught just absolutely unloading, saying that I'm this terrible victim who's lying in the gutter with knives and people killing me, and all I wanted was
and you people want to topple the prime minister, she's saying.
She says that to the police, but she says, all I wanted was a bit of positive, and then she says objective coverage. Does it matter if the prime minister's wife is, as she comes across in the film, she looks like a pretty appalling person in the film, and Yair Netanyahu the same. Do those things matter to the politics of a country if, we're talking not about the prime minister, but the wife and the son?
They matter if those characters have influence over the prime minister. Otherwise, I think they don't. But time and time again, people both on the record and off the record said how important Yair and Sarah were in terms of shaping Benjamin's worldview. Yair is very keen on social media. He's always online. Bibi is not. Bibi doesn't have a cell phone. He doesn't post. He doesn't know what a tweet is. It's not a tweet. Is it still called a tweet if it's on X? Sorry, showing my age.
You're asking 2 social media Luddites here, so I don't know the answer to that.
Bibi, he requires everything printed out on paper. So Yair
like
mediates, Yair mediates his interaction with the modern world of social media, and he's important. And Sarah's important. She knows his schedule. We touch on this in the film. She's the trust boss. She's the one who says, because she's a psychologist. There's that famous Israeli recording, psychologist, and she spells it out. She says she's the psychologist. She understands the way people think, and Bibi doesn't. So she approves appointments or says to Benjamin, we can't trust them. It felt important to include them. And I think that this idea of like these singular characters is misleading. Everyone has a family, everyone has partners or, advisors. And if you look at the good history books, they emphasize that.
Yeah, I think that famous recording is she's yelling at a communications expert, Shaya Sega, that she wants the Israeli public to talk more about the fact that she has degrees in psychology, what you mentioned. To me, again, there were so many fascinating characters there, either investigated or asked these questions by police. Miriam Edelson, for example, sitting there and saying, we always pay for them. And then the police interrogators say, why do you always pay? And she says, well, ask them. All of their friends are rich. I mean, there are these moments where even if I think Israelis knew all of this, seeing it the way they do in your film is a very different kind of thing. And I wonder, if you ask yourself, how do you think this ends? How do you think the Netanyahu rule ends eventually? Is it because of the war? Is it because of politics? Is it because of this corruption case? How does it end?
I don't know. I mean, he's certainly got a bit of tailwind now, right? Mm-hmm. With as Ami Ayalon says, he thrives in chaos. And with the fall of Syria, all my friends and sort of colleagues are texting me going, best thing ever for Netanyahu.
Well, it proves that someone needs to have a lot of luck as well, besides being a maverick politician, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can't see him going to jail at this point. I think he will try everything in his power not to, whether that means pushing out the Attorney General. The longer the trial goes on, the more the extreme right can really sink their hooks into the judicial system. And that's great for his trial, and the more, it's destabilized the region, the more war there is, the more he can say, forget about this trial, I've got more important things to do.
Well, the film is the Bibi Files. It is a very astonishing, stunning piece of work. If you're in Israel, you're going to have to get someone to send you a bootlegged copy with Alexis's very stern disapproval not. And if you're outside the country, you can see it. It's now on release in the UK and elsewhere. Alexis Bloom, thanks so much for talking to us on Unholy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Well, a strong recommend for that film, because it really is just as a piece of work, it is amazing to see these people absolutely in the wild like that. At one point, I think one of them says, no one's ever going to see this, right? And but just unloading against Netanyahu, and then the Netanyahu families themselves doing themselves no favours at all. For
an Israeli, I think a lot of these quotes have come out in print, and in quotation marks, but to see these people actually saying some of these things. And I think, again, the thing that you go back and forth on, and we mentioned it in the conversation, the Sarah Netanyahu, Yair Netanyahu. By the way, I would send our listeners to an episode we did, I think about 2 years ago, called Netanyahu II, with Haaretz journalist Chaim Levinson, about the effect that Yair Netanyahu has on his father, politically and in other realms. I think that's very relevant to what you see.
Before we get to our awards, which, as you said, Yoni, have something of a theme connecting them, I thought a mention of a story in another week we may have delved even deeper into this, but just as a potential harbinger of things to come, Adas Israel, big synagogue, conservative synagogue in Washington. I used to go to 2 synagogues when I was in Washington. There was one I went to, and no, I really did go to 2. There was the Keshe Israel, which is kind of Orthodox. In Georgetown, I used to
Why be simple if you could be complicated?
No, I would dabble, but I would shuttle betwing the 2.
And then the
Israel,
third synagogue you'd never, ever go to,
exactly,
right?
Completely right. So Keshe Israel was the Orthodox one. You'd see Joe Lieberman there, the late Joe Lieberman, in one part of town. And then Adas Israel is the conservative synagogue. They had extended an invitation for an evening with former, just recently defenestrated Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. That invitation was withdrawn. He was disinvited following objections from members of the congregation.
Yeah, I mean, that is, first of all, when we read that for the first time, I think you and I were both amazed by this. I mean, he's the Israeli defense minister. This is a man, really, who has given 40 years of his life for the defense of Israel. This is amazing. It's a synagogue. It's not, trying to speak on the Columbia campus. I hear that now what is said is that they're worried about security threats as well for the congregants after they left the event and things like that. But the original story was about congregants not wanting to hear him. Look, this is a very big story. Anyway, you turn it around. And if this is and by the way, this is after the ICC issued a warrant. The United States is a country that he could still visit. He has family there. So if after everything that has happened, it's a synagogue that says no to listen to a defense minister. I mean, we're in a very, very worrying place, I think.
No, look, the reason why I said harbinger is that, of course, Gallant, along with Netanyahu, is wanted now by the International Criminal Court and will face arrest in all kinds of places in the world. So this is the kind of future. But the difference here is this would normally be home turf. This would be a safe, as it were, safe place. It's America, it's Washington, it's as you said, it's a synagogue. But it seems one of the members of the community, Benjamin Temshin, if I'm pronouncing that right, met one of the synagogue's rabbis to object to the event, saying, this is the quote he gave to the Forward, "I don't see Adas opening the door to Smotrich. I don't see them opening the door to Ben Gvir. How is Gallant different?" I mean, a lot of people would have a lot of answers.
In so many ways.
Right?
The answer is in so many ways.
A lot of people would immediately come back with that. But this is a sign, this is something happening, which says if you're part, maybe it's just enough that you were part of Netanyahu's coalition. That means you are sort of, forbidden on the blacklist, as it were, or maybe it's because of the ICC warrant. Either way, I think this is just, a portent really of how things are changing and how many in the diaspora are going one way, even pretty mainstream in a Jewish institution like this, and Israel is obviously going another. So we note that before we get to our awards. Well, I thought for chutzpah, we have had a kind of linguistic debate on the podcast since the start, really, about the precise meaning of chutzpah. And we had the brilliant Malcolm Gladwell on, who really dived deeply into this issue. And it turns out there is a kind of Israeli meaning and a sort of American Jewish meaning. And the American Jewish meaning is that it's kind of brio and sort of pluck and cojones, sort of in a admirable way. Moxie, exactly. A word that doesn't really exist outside America, but is perfect for this. And it's sort of admirable, whereas the Israeli sense that we normally do when we hand out awards is for sort of outrageous cheek that you don't like. So this week, I think we break from our usual pattern because actually it's that Israeli meaning that we usually go with and go with the more American one, the admirable moxie. I'm going to use that word now a lot, shown by the marketing team over at beloved kosher brand Manischewitz. A lot of people will have Manischewitz Concord grape Kiddush wine in their cupboard ready for Friday night. They have realized they've spotted a smart opportunity by signing up as a sort of, brand ambassador, if you like, or somebody to be emblazoned on their products with his face, and in fact, a whole photograph of him on their boxes of matzahs. One, Jake Retzlaff, who is a quarterback for the Brigham Young University College football team. Brigham Young, of course, being a Mormon college. They only have 3 Jewish students at Brigham Young, the Mormon University in Utah, but one of them is Jake Retzlaff, who is astonishingly good at what Americans insist on calling football, and he is their star quarterback. He has nabbed a sponsorship deal with Manischewitz. I love this. The deal is going to run from Hanukkah to Pesach. He will be on there on the matzahs, but they make a whole lot of other things. What are the other products? I think you can get frozen latkes. You can definitely get tinned kosher chicken soup. Don't think I didn't have that when I made my first appearances in Washington. He says, Retzlaff, Manischewitz has always been part of my life. I grew up with matzah with peanut butter as my favorite snack. And every Passover, my family and I made matzah pizza together. So a shout out to the marketing geniuses over at Manischewitz for realizing that the Jewish quarterback in college football, and particularly playing for the Mormon team, was a perfect face for their brand. So credit and a chutzpah award to Manischewitz.
Chutzpah in a good sense.
In a good way, massively, yeah.
How many bottles of Manischewitz do you have in your house?
Now, not so many, because, why? But we don't have so many.
What kind of Jew are you?
Well, because it's not big. Okay,
you?
okay, you've opened this up. In Manischewitz, you don't really get outside America. It's harder. You can, but it's harder. So here, what we have is Palwin. I must have talked about Palwin Kiddush wine.
You have not. You have not.
This is a huge topic. There are different varieties for
Should we have an extra bonus episode for this?
We could do this. If you're
okay.
if you're friend or family, you'll get the full detail. But basically, 4, 4A, and 10. Nobody I know has ever been able to tell me or discern a difference in taste between these three varieties. But the reason why it's significant, I think, is Palwyn is one of the last places in the Jewish world where the name of Palestine lives on, because just as the Jerusalem Post used to be the Palestine Post, Palwyn is the Palestine Wine Company. It's from the Yishuv period.
Yeah, wow.
20s and 30s.
That's amazing.
I know this from my late father, who told me that in 1948 he remembered that bottles changed and became Israelwin, the Israel Wine Company. Totally bombed. No one wanted Israelwin wine. It went back to Palwyn. So Palwyn is the last bit left in the Jewish world that has Palestine in the name.
Uh-huh.
And that's,
so you couldn't have told me all of this when I had Shabbat dinner at your house? Now I have to do this?
I regret that I didn't do that, because it would have been so stimulating for you to hear that round the Friday night dinner table. You'd have thought we are never, ever going back to that house again.
If we have any listener left after that, dear listener, thank you for staying with us.
Thank you for clinging on.
Staying with sports and staying with Jews, as we do on this podcast. Jewish-American athlete Max Fried signs a record-breaking contract with the New York Yankees, and he is our Mensch of the week. It's an 8-year, $218 million deal. Largest contract in baseball history, both for a Jewish player and a left-handed pitcher. Us left-handed co-hosts appreciate that, I think.
I thought you were about to claim that you were a left-handed pitcher, and I thought that would be
I wasn't a left-handed pitcher yet, but I think I can go places in my life. You just need to believe in me a little bit.
It's all ahead of you. The baseball career lies ahead. So I'm tempted to say, yes, he's made a lot of money for himself, but why do we think he's a mensch, Yonit?
Because, I mean, first of all, I love the responses to this story. I mean, Jewish Yankee fans are like celebrating his signing, and they're tweeting a Jewish Max on the Yankees. We did it. I think it's great. I think he deserves the Mensch Award. You don't think so?
No,
your standards are getting a bit high. Do you notice that?
I'm very happy, and he's brought delight to Jewish sports fans in New York City and around the world. So that is reason enough. While talking about Mensches, all of you who have signed up to be a friend or family member of the podcast world of Unholy Family, we are grateful to you. You are all Mensches in our eyes. That is really doing great stuff, helping us get the podcast in front of more people. So we are grateful to you.
Right, and we will say our thank yous on the topic of grateful. Our thank yous to Michal Porat and Gili Remen. We are on YouTube and on Instagram. And what am I missing? LinkedIn.
Blue Sky.
What else am I missing?
We have a little. We have an
Blue
account
Sky
on Blue
X.
Sky. We're all over.
We do. Amazing. All over the social, as my friend Jonathan Friedland likes to say. And we shall meet next week.